I'm Lee Moore,
I'm Rob Moore.
and this is the Chinese Literature Podcast.
Lee, you're sounding good. You're sounding better than usual.
Yeah, Rob, you're sounding different too.
Better than before, anyway. The podcast before, we sounded like we were recording in a broom closet.
We still are recording in a broom
It's a larger broom closet, but it's not the broom closet that's making us sound good.
No, it's this new equipment that we've gotten from CAPS, the Center for Asian and Pacific Studies at the University of Oregon.
They very, very kindly decided to support the podcast and have bought us new mics, audio interface, cords, desktop stands.
It looks professional. They really they invested in this podcast.
We actually look like we know what we're doing now. We don't. We just look like we do. Which is important.
But we convinced the good folks at CAPS that we know what we're doing.
We hoodwinked them.
But, just again, a big thank you to the Center for Asian and Pacific Studies. They're a great resource. They support a lot of different programs in Oregon. And I believe beyond Oregon, anything that has to do with the study of Asia or the Pacific, they're just a fantastic resource.
Yeah,
I can't say enough good about them.
Right, yeah. And not just because we have new equipment. We've worked with them before. They're a great resource. So let's go ahead and jump in to what we're talking about today, we can take advantage of our new stuff.
Yeah. So we've got this guy. He's very today's text. He's not really that well known.
He's kind of a fringe figure. Confucius is his name.
Is that how you pronounce it? I'm not actually sure.
Confucius, something like that.
I sometimes get it confused with other things.
Lee's known for his sharp wit. Confused and Confucius is sort of the apex of his humor. So we may refer to him in the podcast as Kongzi because Lee and I both, because of the sources we read, sometimes it's Confucius. And in the Chinese, it's almost always Kongzi.
Yeah.
Master, Kongzi in classical Chinese almost always indicates master and Kong. So Lee, why if he's Kongzi in Chinese, do we have the English translation as Confucius?
It's a little confusing. He also has another name in Chinese that's rarely used today, but it's Confucius. And Confucius was the term used when the first, I believe, Catholic scholars arrived in southeastern China in modern-day Guangzhou. And that is, they transliterated his name into Latin, and that's where Confucius comes from. So Mencius is also a Latinized version of Mengzi, his disciple.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So this is one of the many interesting things about the authorship of some of these classics, because much like the canonical Gospels in the Christian Bible, what we have of Confucius is not what he himself sat down and wrote, or at least not all of it. There's a lot of contestation about whether he wrote any of it, whether he wrote a portion of it.
And even his status as a historical figure is a source of contestation.
Still a source of some debate, because a lot of the sources that discuss him, much like the Confucius, some of these works attributed to Confucius themselves, which refer to other figures we know nothing about. It's the quotes themselves that establish who they are.
A lot of the documents that talk about Confucius as a person don't come until much later.
Right.
Several centuries after Confucius died.
Right.
Which we should go ahead and ground the listener in history. We're talking about 2,500 years ago. Confucius probably
Warring States period. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So this is a period where China is not really ruled by any overarching power. I would suggest that there isn't really this idea of China, in that it's a political ideal to have a single government governing all of these different states. Depending on what time, you've got quite a few, but 7 or 8 very large ones, depending on the time again. But there is a shared culture. I would say it's kind of like Europe in the 17th, 18th century. There's a shared culture. They all kind of are reading much of the same things. They're discussing many of the same problems. You've got essentially a shared discourse, and that's what Confucius is drawing off of. But he's going from different states, and he's trying to essentially recruit disciples who want to, after applying his learning, go and work as a minister for a good ruler.
And this is very important to understand about Confucius, because there's definitely an aspect of him that seeks to have strong central states.
Yeah.
This does not mean that he ever believed that the states should control everything with no accountability from the people. That's not a concept attributed to these works. But it is definitely true that what he is looking for is a strong governmental system.
And this is a debate that goes on to this day. What is the people?
Right. And this is one of the things that I think...
I mean, we're having this debate in American society.
Did you ever see the movie? The Chinese movie Confucius?
I refuse to
with
see
Chow
that
Yun-fat.
kind of
I watched it when I was in China with a friend of mine. We almost started laughing because if there's one thing almost everyone can agree on with Confucius is that he is the teacher. He is the great teacher. And there's barely a scene in the movie where he's actually teaching, but there are a lot of scenes with him trying to return back to his home kingdom and support the government there.
Yeah.
And it's really peculiar.
Well, I mean, it's a work of propaganda
sure.
by a state that wants to,
Right, exactly. But anyway, so we're getting a little far afield. The reason we decided to talk about this today was a lot of reasons, but
it's been kind of a big hole in our podcast.
We haven't talked about Confucius at all. It's weird.
Yeah.
Although this is a literary podcast,
I would make the argument for our sake that once you get to earlier periods of Chinese history.
Right.
That the difference between literature and history and philosophy just kind of disappears. I think of Zhuangzi as one of my favorite literary writers, but he's a philosopher. We did a podcast on him already.
Right.
I think we can, make that same argument for Confucius.
Right, and we should point out, this is the last little historical trivia thing we're going to mention until we get into the text, but the term literature as a sort of independent thing doesn't even really exist in China until very far into the modern era. 19th century, the term wenxue gets brought over from the Japanese. It's an adaptation from a Japanese term.
It's an adaptation, which is an adaptation from Western sources.
Right. So before then, you have general categories like the classics. Even something like poetry is subsumed in other things, right?
Yeah. But you didn't have... there's a debate. You didn't have, but essentially, we don't have any fiction from much earlier than about 1800,
right,
AD,
or at least not well documented fiction.
Anyway, I mean, there's ghost stories,
right? And you have, if you want to classify some of what Zhuangzi wrote, some of the parables as that. Anyway, the actual text we're talking about is called the Analects in English, the Lunyu in Chinese.
Which I think it just, in Chinese, Lunyu just means like debated words or something like that.
Discussed words, yeah.
Something.
It's one of the few texts that a lot of people attribute directly to Confucius. It is likely the majority of it was just compiled by his disciples. But
there are some other texts that Confucius supposedly edited, and those are important for the Confucian tradition, but this is the thing that might actually be his words as, kind of scribbled by his disciples. And in terms of genre and how it works, this is essentially just a kind of greatest hits quotation book. There's not really any kind of long space for argument.
Right.
And one of the things that's so maddening about the Analects is it seems to go in a lot of different directions. Right. The quotes in one place will conflict with quotes from the other parts of the Analects, and so it's just very difficult to interpret.
And that makes it interesting as well when you're reading something from a European American perspective, where you're used to something like Plato or even Kant or Hegel, where it seems to have a central argument winding its way through. Yeah. This is different. This is just literally a collection of sayings, almost all, or maybe all, as far as I know, prefaced by Ziyue, the master says. So we're going to talk about one of those master says, and it's one of the single most important concepts, or not even concepts, but phrases in the study of Chinese literature. It's quite short as well.
I would say you can't understand Chinese literature without understanding this phrase.
Do you want to just read the Chinese for us real quick, and then we'll dig into it?
Yeah, sure. So we're looking at Lunyu 7.1. 书而不作，信而好古. So can you translate that for us, Rob?
Well, the best translation we have really is to transmit and not create, to trust and value the ancients or the ancient ones. There's a following phrase at the end in which Confucius compares himself to Lao Peng. No one's really sure who Lao Peng or Old Peng was, so we're not really going to talk about him right now. But those two first little phrases, to transmit, not create.
And I would actually say, to offer an alternative translation, I transmit, I don't create. That's the way I've heard it translated, because there is oftentimes no subject in classical Chinese.
Right.
I transmit, I don't create. I trust and love the ancients.
Love or value. Hao,
yeah.
in modern Chinese, hao is almost always an adjective, but in classical it can be
a verb.
To value, to
and
appreciate.
It's clearly a verb here.
Anyway, you cannot overestimate how important this thought is.
Absolutely.
It is one of the dominant guiding influences into, even now, in terms of how scholarship is done and how literature is written. Into the 19th century, one of the dominant schools of thought, for example, or not even schools of thought, but school of scholarship, is just called evidentiary scholarship. And the entire group...
Kaozheng, right?
Kaozheng, yeah. The whole group was based around the idea that what we do is not create new things. We need to clarify the old things, all old things. We need to do just meticulous scholarship on every single word in every book. And that's into the 19th century.
What's interesting about the evidentiary scholarship, Kaozheng Shui, is that in some ways it has parallels to the Renaissance of Western Europe.
That's very true.
You have people kind of adopting a more humanistic perspective and reconsidering the value and truthfulness of ancient classics.
And it's also one of the reasons why so much of Chinese scholarship into even the modern era sought. I think there's a cutoff point when that's no longer the dominant thing, but for the longest time it was the dominant idea to look for the past for inspiration and justification, not anything that could be in the future, and certainly not the present.
This one line in the Analects is, I would say, if not the only, the kind of it's the spark that ignites that whole manner of thinking.
And it's even the way it's composed adds to that, because it's not that the idea itself has value. It's because it's because the master says. If it was just a person they found, it would not carry the same weight. But because it's Kongzi himself who said it, it adds weight to it.
But I guess the counter argument to that is, I assume that Confucius had to say some pretty good things in order to get that status.
Yeah. We don't just have this random thing and all the rest, who knows who he is. I agree. But his identity and who he was is one of the things that makes the concept itself
absolutely
what it is.
And to go back to something we mentioned earlier, we said this is the only text that may have his actual words. But you'll note we said we don't know how, we're not sure about his historical circumstances. He almost certainly personally did not write any of this down, so he's not creating it. Mm-hmm. Someone else is transmitting what he created. And his most influential work, in some ways, the stuff that he may have written down, was actually him editing ancient text. Mm-hmm. And so he is, in a way, if whatever his historical status is, the legends of him, the stories that we have coming down about him, are enacting this phrase in a very important and kind of, fascinating way.
It is. And let's dig into some of that, of the consequences of this, of transmitting, not creating, specifically that. The idea that the good scholar does not seek to change or to expand on what's been done. All the scholar seeks to do is clarify what was already great to begin with. So, and let's dig into a little bit of the consequences this has. And, you could... And there are literally books about it, so we can't do a podcast. But there are, I think, we talked about three interesting examples, one of which is contestable, which will lead to some debate, which is good. But what's the first one we were talking about, Lee?
We were talking about Sima Qian. Sima Qian, we've done a podcast on him. He's the historian from mid-Han Dynasty, so we're talking,
right, towards the end of the BC era.
Yeah. He claims that he is not he's not creating history. He's just recording what ancients have already recorded. And he claims that he acts sort of as an editor. And that's absolutely not what he does. He is the founder of Chinese history. He's the first person we have a name for writing, a name to put as far as a history. And he makes profoundly authorial arguments. And by that, I mean that it's clearly one, maybe two guys who are making this writing this gigantic history, piecing stuff together. But as they piece it together, when they string things together, he's making an argument, and he writes beautifully to the point where he's one of my favorite examples of classical Chinese. And he is essentially using this 疏而不作, this I transmit, I do not create. And he frames his argument and he frames his rhetoric in those terms. But I also don't think that he really trusts that. He says he's doing that, but he's clearly not. And he uses that almost as a screen to hide behind. So when he says that, or when he kind of makes that claim, he's trying to hide how much he is actually creating, how much of his thought goes into the writing of that history. It's not a transmission. It's a new, unique thing that he's doing.
Well, and to me, what's important too about that is not simply that he is an author using something to say he's not an author, but that he had to do that at all. If he had simply compiled these histories himself and said, "Hey, I wrote a history of our people up to now," it's highly unlikely anyone would have considered it credible. Mm-hmm. But if he says, "I have looked at all the old sources and that's what I'm giving you," all of a sudden it becomes vastly more important and credible to people. This is actually an interesting example because it's a prototype for any sort of literary innovation that happens later. There has to be some sense of, yes, I'm doing something new, but really what I'm doing is just bringing forward stuff we've been doing forever. Right? Even the Mingqing short stories bring in quotations from ancient sources or that claim to be ancient sources.
Right. And they try and hide behind that screen that Sima Qian was doing.
Right, exactly. But that's interesting because innovation then has to be both new and old, even in the very beginning of this stuff.
To be new, you have to position yourself as if old. You're old.
Right.
And even if you are new, oftentimes what you see is people claiming that what they're doing is just a restoration of something much older. So they are essentially restoring their, great-great-great-grandfather's generation, and the generations in between have screwed it up.
Yeah.
Essentially. I mean, you have this with Zhu Xi. So Zhu Xi is the founder of Neo-Confucianism. He says, I'm just restoring Confucianism to what it was when Confucius was there, and these previous generations just kind of mucked it up. But what he's actually doing is creating a whole new philosophy that draws off of older forms of Confucianism, but it is something totally different.
And that brings us into the second example, which is, Lee and I have had, and will continue to have, running debates on the value of the May 4th movement starting in 1919.
Probably the biggest divide, not only between you and me, but throughout Chinese literature, right. the Chinese literary studies.
But for better or worse, aesthetically, one of the things that this movement does is basically seek to, whether they succeeded or not is debatable, but seek to shatter any notion that you have to look to the past in order to do something new.
They tried to do that.
Yes, but they
made that claim.
Yeah, but this is why it's a very interesting movement, because Lu Xun in particular was just driven to distraction by this idea that we have to always be looking backwards. He's looking around, especially as he's being educated in Tokyo, and he's looking at science and modern concepts being applied to an Asian culture in profound ways. He's looking and going, we don't have to look to the ancients. We could look at stuff right now. Why are we not doing this? And so one of the reasons he begins to write his own works in literature is to say, I don't need to transmit. I can just create. And it can be unlike things that have been done before and have value. Now, again, as Lee and I argue, how valuable they are is up for debate. But I think it's not debatable that this sets an interesting precedent for the rest of the century.
Yeah.
Because the first person that says, look, I don't care about old stuff. In fact, I think it's useless. I'm going to do something else, makes it that much easier for other people to say the same thing.
Is it okay? I actually think that this extends to contemporary politics.
I do. We had a little mini debate about this earlier.
Can I give my example?
Go for it.
I've been reading some graduate students who are applying for jobs. Friends of mine, I'm helping them out. They're Chinese, and they always refer to this phrase, New China, just as an ideological kind of phrase that refers to post-1949 China.
Right.
That the communists, they like to say that they have established a new China. So the claim is coming out of Lucian that there is this break, that they are creating a new China. They're not just retransmitting the old stuff in a new jar or something. So that is even today incredibly potent. And I try and get who I'm helping out to stop saying that, just because it's
in the American job market, it's weird.
It's weird in any kind of, I mean, even from I would argue, if you're trying to be objective, because there is no new China, it isn't a real break. There can't be a new China.
Depending, of course, on your perspective.
Yeah, I think we'll leave it
at
that.
The Maoist era is profoundly different.
But I think you could argue Mao is essentially an emperor.
Well, I'm going to talk about that in just a second, actually. But I was going to offer a counterexample about transmission. When I was in grad school at Nankai in Tianjin, I was talking with a friend of mine who was also in the master's program. I forget where she came from, maybe Shanxi. Anyway, she was telling me that, what she'd been taught was that the best kind of master's thesis is 90% other people's work, 10% your work.
And I definitely think that's something that's true in most Chinese academic work.
I think so too. You have to be able to prove you've read and mastered the other stuff before what you say will have any weight at all.
And I think in the tendency in academia in America is to
the reverse.
The exact reverse. You have to try and get students to say, hey, you need to couch this in other people's scholarships. I'm guilty of this too. I want to just kind of say my own thing.
And I will say, this is the thing. I used to think, cards on the table, I used to think this was a completely idiotic way to go about doing things, because I come from a tradition.
The Western way or the Chinese way?
The Chinese way. And I come from a tradition where you're supposed to always be thinking of new things. Having started my own doctoral work here, the actual thesis, I've realized there's a lot lacking in this department and a lot of Western scholarship. And the reason I say this is because I banged my head against the wall for months trying to figure out how to pursue the specific topic I'm doing. The moment I shifted over and started reading Chinese journal articles, a wealth of bibliographical information came my way that I didn't even know existed. And that's precisely because there's so much emphasis on making sure you know where you're getting your stuff.
Not creating.
But
there's something to be said, like, it's really boring to read Chinese scholarship.
A lot of it, yeah.
A lot of
some of it can be thrilling in small doses,
sure.
yeah.
But a lot of it is quite boring just because it's all about transmitting, and there's nothing innovative or interesting about that.
Some of it is. But my point, I think, where you're going with this and where I would agree is that the ideal is the best of both worlds. Some of the sort of the richer and analytical tradition that we use, but based on a lot more of this mastery of the sources that comes from Chinese scholarship.
Yeah, I agree with that. I would put it slightly differently. And I would say both traditions have something that they can learn from the other. Both actually have value.
And need each other. I would argue need each other.
Absolutely.
And this actually brings me to the last example, because I don't think nearly enough people are paying attention to what's going to be going on in China in October, which is the National Party Congress, a once every 5-year event where they more or less plan out the next 5 years. And the reason...
It's a communist shindig.
It's huge. It's massively important. There's a lot of writing about Xi Jinping, and it's interesting. A lot of the writing I read right now, trying to grapple with who is this guy and what is he doing, points back to his supposed early fascination with Mao's Little Red Book. He grew up in the era when this was what everyone was supposed to read. And one of the things that gives him street cred in the party is his passion for the Little Red Book and Mao's thoughts as a younger communist. And supposedly, he's just carried it with him. Like, this is what he's based himself on ever since. If you're in China, Mao's reputation is somewhat problematic, to put it mildly. You meet people who loathe him, and you meet people who think he's wonderful.
Yeah.
The party contrary to what a lot of people think, the party members are not stupid. They're aware of
They're
Mao's...
the ones who have access to a lot more knowledge.
They're the ones
than
that have read a ton of sources
public,
about... They're aware of Mao's fraught reputation, especially abroad. So it doesn't do to staunchly promote Mao everywhere you go. You have to have some distance from Mao. And yet, here we are right back at this transmission thing. If you make a final cut, we're no longer associated with Mao, the party loses its credibility. It has to have some connection to Mao, or it's not the same party.
It's kind of the 1979 compromise that Mao was 30% bad and 70% good. It's this. I mean, you can kind of see this 疏而不做, like they are creating, but they're hiding. They're essentially it's a new regime in 78. It's not communist. It's a capitalist regime. I mean, they have how many millionaires, but they can't claim that they are creating something new. They have to couch it in terms of the old, which is what communism is in this field.
Well, one of the things that's fascinating about this, though, is that it's not that there are no longer classics, quote unquote, but there are just new classics.
Yeah.
Now it's Marx, it's Mao. Whether or not you actively base your thinking or your creation on them, much like Sima Qian, whether or not you actually use them every day is less important than that people believe you're using them every day, because the new stuff is only valuable if it's connected to the old stuff, right? And maybe not even really old, just since the 50s or 60s even.
Yeah.
But you have to bring that into discussion. Why does this matter? It matters because not nearly enough people, in my opinion, studying modern communism in China, at least in the popular press, there's a lot of this in the academic press, are looking into how has Maoist thought and Maoist iconography survived? Why is it still influencing this? Is it actively influencing it? Are people actively reading Mao for inspiration? And if not, what does that mean? How is that continuing to help shape policy?
Rob, I think those pearls of wisdom are a great place to just call it.
I tend to think every podcast should just end with my pearls of wisdom.
Well, let's not pollute it anymore.
I agree.
I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast.